Vladimir Putin is continuing to play his games with Trump by giving him just enough to declare any kind of partial victory, but not enough to actually end the war. Do you see these tactics as a strategy to buy more time for his army to capture more Ukrainian land while pretending to demonstrate serious willingness to have a ceasefire?
Yes, completely. So if you look at the peace negotiations, you've got Trump, who is doing it, frankly, for pure vanity, with a total lack of understanding about the strategic geopolitical picture, or indeed how the Russian way of war operates. And meanwhile, President Putin, who is no great strategist, but he's a very fine opportunist, is seemingly laughing because Trump's initiative is playing very nicely into Putin's hands. And as you say, when the music stops, when the fighting stops, events on the ground will dictate what happens. And that has always been why it's so important for Ukraine to get in the very strongest position possible, such that when the war comes to a conclusion, President Zelensky has a very, very strongest position. President Putin clearly wishes to do the reverse. And it's quite clear that is why he pushed in recent weeks very hard to retake the Kursk salient, because he knows that little bite into Russian land gave President Zelensky a very, very potent bargaining chip. For me, it was always a very clever strategic play by President Zelensky, by the Ukrainians, to take that piece of Russian territory. And so President Putin is trying to secure as much territory as he can at the moment, in case he is somehow forced into a proper peace negotiation. But I don't see what the Americans think they've got at their disposal to bring about that negotiation, which is why it feels like a fool's errand. And sadly, the position of the United States, who are so much better as a nation than they're currently behaving. We shouldn't lose faith in the United States of America. They're a wonderful nation. They've done great things over the decades, but the current administration is confused and it is naive, and they are playing into President Putin's hands.
And can you imagine a scenario in which Donald Trump will start to understand the nature of this war and Vladimir Putin's real aims and real intentions in this war? Is there a chance for a big confrontation between Trump and Putin, and Trump putting pressure on Vladimir Putin?
Well, who knows? I mean, I think that if we've all learned anything about President Trump in his last term and this term, it's his total unpredictability. There's no great strategic thought. He acts on a whim. I think President Zelensky's appeal to President Trump in recent days, that President Trump should come to Ukraine and see for himself the impact of the war, seems to me a very smart play, because it sort of appeals to President Trump's ego. And Trump is dominated, is dictated, his thinking is all about himself. It is about his ego, and it's about how he's going to be perceived. So I think that's a smart play, and that could unlock things. But the reality is that President Trump only acts in his own self-interest. And so what might unlock it, what might change President Trump's approach and sophistication in his approach to the peace process, if you can call it such a thing, would be Trump feeling humiliated by the dialogue with President Putin. And at the moment, he is being humiliated, but he's not publicly recognizing that yet. But at some point, will that trigger President Trump into some kind of alternative approach that is more favorable to Ukraine, and indeed more favorable to the international rules-based system time will tell.
Also, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Army, General Syrsky, says that Russia has already begun its offensive in the Sumy and Kharkiv regions of Ukraine. Do you feel that this is also another humiliation for Donald Trump, and could this change the balance of power at the negotiating table? How could this influence this negotiations process?
Yeah, I mean, so the degree to which President Trump, frankly, is conversant with the detail about what's going on the ground, I think is an entirely moot point. I don't have any great confidence that he is tracking the fine detail of what is happening. But if President Trump concludes that President Putin is acting in bad faith and is somehow laughing at him, and I think President Putin is doing that, but if President Trump begins to believe that he is losing face over the entire process, not least because of the Russians' acts on the ground and this what appears to be the early stages of an offensive, then that may trigger President Trump taking a different approach, but only time will tell.
And also, let's cover Russia's strike on the city of Sumy. It's a deadly strike of the Russian Federation this year, killing more than 35 people and more than 100 people were wounded. Also, it's interesting moment that these strikes happened after Steve Witkoff meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. What is your reaction to this, and do you see any kind of link between these meetings between Witkoff, Putin, and Russia's strikes on civilian population?
Well, who knows? All I would say is that the Russians, they're a canny bunch, as you well know. You all in Ukraine know better than any of us. And they tend not to do things like this by accident. They're masters at sending messages. So let's be absolutely clear. The strike on Sumy was absolutely despicable. It's a war crime. There's absolutely no justification for it. And oh, by the way, President Trump's throwaway comment that he's heard that it was a mistake, it does a great disservice to the victims of that strike, to the population of Sumy, and indeed to the whole Ukraine nation. And it does a great disservice, frankly, to the intelligence apparatus as a whole that knows full well what President Putin and the Russians are doing. It also points to the fact that regrettably, the Russian disinformation campaign, and anyone who is familiar with Russia's tactics knows, long before the Ukraine campaign, that they are masters at disinformation. It is a centerpiece of their military and their state doctrine. And what is terrifying is it appears that disinformation arm is having an effect in the White House. I mean, how extraordinary is that? How naive is that? That members of the United States administration could be parroting that sort of disinformation.
From your perspective, who could be these people around Trump who are providing such information to the US president about mistakes of the Russian army? Who could be those people? It seems like Trump did not refer to some intelligence operations, to some intel information.
Yes, I mean, again, I think this is what's so worrying about the current situation. We all know that the United States intelligence apparatus, their interagency structure, is frankly unrivaled in the world. They have fantastic intelligence agencies. They have incredible reach. They have incredibly professional intelligence operators and analysts backed up by some of the best intelligence technology in the world. But what isn't happening at the moment, seemingly, is that the deduction from that intelligence architecture isn't finding its way into President Trump's decision making. And whether that's because he's willfully ignoring it, whether because he's not taking the briefings, whether it's because those briefings are somehow being diluted by political advisors, it's almost impossible to tell. But I simply do not accept any suggestion that the United States intelligence apparatus, that we all have great faith in, doesn't know what's going on. Of course it does. But it's not finding its way into what comes out of President Trump's mouth, shall we say that. I don't know what goes on in his head. We can only see what comes out of his mouth and what he puts out on social media. So who is it who's giving him this kind of bizarre, perverse version of events? I don't know. You'd have to speak to people better placed than me as to who President Trump really listens to, other than his obvious administration advisors.
According to Reuters, Steve Witkoff proposed Trump to give up 4 Ukrainian regions to Russia as a part of a peace deal. According to this Reuters sources, according to Steve Witkoff, this could be the best way forward, the fastest way to broker a ceasefire in Ukraine. What could such a deal mean for Ukraine and global security, and how can you assess this Steve Witkoff's initiative?
Yeah, and if you look at that with General Kellogg's comments, which I thought were again very naive and disrespectful to Ukraine, this idea that somehow you could carve up Ukraine in the image of Berlin after the Second World War, where, as your viewers will know, Berlin was split into international zones between the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France, and that somehow that sort of model could be used in Ukraine. It is playing so strongly into President Putin's hands. You know, the whole point about a negotiation when it comes is you've got to have cards to play. And if you cede everything with that sort of proposal, then you go into the peace process with no cards to play. But more importantly, what does that then say about the rules-based international system that we all rely on? The sovereignty of Ukraine, that regions of Ukraine would be given up in that manner, I think is very damaging. And so I would have every sympathy with President Zelensky not entertaining such an approach.
Let's also cover UK and France-led coalition of the willing. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron are organizing this big coalition of the willing, troops to be deployed to Ukraine after full ceasefire deal. What is your assessment of this plan?
Well, look, I have to say, I think it was smart of Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron to come up with something, a coalition of the willing, because in the absence of the United States, somebody has got to do something. You know, if there were to be a peace deal, then you've got to back it up with some kind of monitoring force. So politically, it seems to me that was a smart move by France. It was a smart move by the United Kingdom to do that, not least to say to the United States, we're listening. We're listening when you say that Europe needs to do more. So politically, I get it. Do I get it strategically and operationally? Not so much. So what do I mean by that? So firstly, it is entirely unclear to me, based on anything that has been publicized by the United Kingdom or anybody else, what the big idea of this force would be. You know, is it a peacekeeping force? You know, there's some random phrases being banded around about what the force's mission might be, without total clarity on the purpose, on the mission, then you're in danger of running into a real disaster. And I have seen nothing to suggest if the true objective, if the true mission is understood, it certainly has been communicated very effectively. So I've seen nothing that I, as a military commander, would recognize to be a credible basis for a mission. It feels muddled at this stage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even once you have decided on what the mission is, and let's hope it is credible, pulling together a coalition of a willing into a credible military force is exceptionally difficult in the absence of, firstly, the United States, who have typically led coalitions of the willing. I think back to the counter-ISIS campaign as for instance, a US-led coalition. If it's going to be led by other nations, in this case, potentially the United Kingdom and France, where's the command and control going to come from? Because the big headquarters that could do it are NATO headquarters. And the idea that President Putin is going to permit a NATO assigned headquarters to deploy into Ukraine, again, feels like a total fool's errand. And then come down a level, ensuring that force has the necessary credibility to do its job, I think there's a very, very long way to go. And so ministers will be saying, and they have been saying, that the planning is well advanced. Well, I hope so. But it's not what I am sensing. I'm sensing this feels like more of a political process than a true operational process. And I think it'd be very, very dangerous for Britain, for France, for these other nations involved in the coalition of the willing, to deploy a force unless the mission is very, very clear. At this stage, it seems to me that it's not.
Thank you, General Jones, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine.